learning architect at Shopify.
And my name is Andrew, and I'm the lead of the learning platform team at Shopify.
So we're a small but mighty team that's working on the tooling challenge for learning teams across the business. So that includes teams like sales, enablement, support, R&D, core education, and learning acceleration. I'll give a really high level view of what Shopify is. So it's a commerce platform that was headquartered in Ottawa, Canada, and we enable over 600,000 merchants across the world. So that's about 175 countries. And we help folks like Elon Musk sell these hats and flamethrowers, but also people like Sarah that has a flower shop and wants to get her flowers to other regions in the Bay Area. But today, our talk is not about our core product, it's about learning. And we're going to tell you a little bit about how we're enabling knowledge share across Shopify through our learning team. But before we jump into the thick of things, I thought we could take a moment and maybe meet someone that you haven't met before. And imagine this. So you start and you join a startup, and you're heading the learning and development part of the business. So there's multiple teams under you that all have different learning audience, learning goals, and you're expanding rapidly. We're saying doubling every 2 years. So we'll take 2 minutes and try to meet someone you haven't talked to before, and think about what tools and systems you'd put in place to help people across the business learn at scale.
You can also cheat and use the things that you've learned about today and think about how would you deploy those. And so find somebody you don't know, talk for 2 minutes.
So we actually won't have time to share all the great learns that you just learned right now, but we will have networking after. But what I hope that you took out of that exercise was that making decisions with a company that's in hypergrowth is really freaking. It's a difficult thing to do. And that's really been our experience. So this is a GIF that represents a little bit of our life right now. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. Like many tech companies, we work in a super fast moving environment, and we're constantly challenged to keep up with the information, get the best tools to help our learning teams do their best work. And that's been our journey at Shopify. So a little context about growth. In 2004, a small group of Canadian entrepreneurs actually wanted to sell snowboards. And they band together. They were looking for a commerce platform online, couldn't find one, so they decided to build one. They literally started as a 4-person team inside of an apartment in Ottawa. And that didn't last too long. They ended up growing quite quickly, hiring more people, got a really legit office in Ottawa. We got more merchants, moved into different regions. We expanded product lines, service lines, and that platform is today known as Shopify. So to keep up with all this growth, our L&D teams also needed to grow and build learning products very quickly. And with this, we had teams that were focused on building engineering onboarding and learning for UX and support and sales enablement. And they all had different audiences and brought in different tools. So some of these tools were actually built in-house, and some of them we were purchasing their third-party tools. And this was a really important time at Shopify. We needed to move fast and get people the right context at the right time. But now at this stage of growth, it's actually a big challenge. So we have multiple teams focused on learning across disciplines, across the business. And so 2 new problems emerge. So one, now we have multiple different entry points to these learning products. That includes tools, but also the other challenge is that there's no connection. So there's no integration for our learners. It's really hard for them to find the right learning at the right time, and it's also hard for our learning teams to evaluate what learning programs have the most impact on our learners. So things looked like this for our learning teams. Things were siloed, there was a lot of overlap, some redundancy, and for our learners, it looked like this. So information overload. It was very hard to find the right things at the right time, and we realized at this point that tooling was really slowing down our teams. So the new challenge was, how do we solve this? How do we get our learning teams to move fast and be responsive to business needs, but also enable knowledge sharing across the business that could scale? And that's where our team emerged. So Andrew and I are really focused on solving the tooling challenges with the different learning teams across Shopify. So we're a unique team because we get to almost service all these different teams across the business that have very different needs. And to achieve our mandate, we had to learn a lot about what these pain points were for L&D. So we established two groups. The first one was the Learning Guild, and this is a group that brings together educators across the business, and they get to share their expertise. We get to know what types of things they're working on, and also the Learning Council, which is a small group of decision makers that represent the four functions that I talked about earlier. And so these folks really help us identify the priorities to inform our product roadmap. So we also looked at the pulse data. So we looked at internal data to figure out what our Shopify folk, how they learn, what things they care about, what fuels their growth at Shopify. Renee talked about coaching earlier on, but we also invest a lot in learning, both internally and externally. So what we learned from the pulse data and also speaking to our key stakeholders were four things. So Shopify folk are self-directed learners, and we really encourage them to take an active role in shaping their own learning. The second thing is that they learn from each other. Peer-to-peer learning is a real thing at Shopify, and that learning happens everywhere. So we have a lot of flex perks, so folks can go to conferences and expense audiobooks, but we also have a lot of learning programs that we invest in internally. And the last thing is that learning is personal. So everyone has a different motivation around learning, and we really need to tailor our products to that. I'm going to pass it to Andrew, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how we use the diffusion of innovation theory in our approach to spreading tools and practices across the organization.
And so ultimately, our learning team, our learning platform team is really focused on enabling this constant learner at Shopify to amplify their impact and reach their full potential. And so Heidee's talked about this broader context of, I'm going to skip ahead to about how we've been working to build this cultural infrastructure at Shopify. So there's the Learning Guild, there's the Learning Council, and I'm going to layer this academic, it's a social science theory called Diffusion of Innovations on top of that, and then we're going to talk about a specific example that we've gone through recently and how these things have played out. And so what Diffusion of Innovations theory, it's from Everett Rogers, and it helps explain this process of how an innovation travels through a society or a company or something like that. And so when we talk about things being hard, it's hard because groups are different and things don't spread just by chance. So we didn't sit down and think about like how would we apply Diffusion of Innovations theory to launching a learning product at Shopify, but in thinking and preparing for this talk, it was really informing our choices. And so what I'm going to talk about, the context of the actual example is this thing called Session. But you've heard ++ mentioned, and they're one of the co-organizers of the event. One of the main problems that the Learning Council and the Pulse survey recognized was that the most important thing for us to try and solve was helping promote and track peer learning, but in a scalable way. So peer learning was happening, but if we can't track it, we don't know what's going on, where the gaps are. We don't know how people should get recognized and rewarded for that. We can't do any of that if we're not tracking. So we did a big search, and luckily we met Mike, we met Marco, and we brought in Plus Plus. We rebranded it Session, because at Shopify Plus means something. That's our white label solution for high value merchants. And at Shopify, a session is really, it's a pretty generic bucket, but it's any sort of internal event where you have people come together and they devote time to a structured activity. So it could be learning or knowledge sharing or a book club or whatever it is. And we use Plus Plus to empower Shopify folk to find, share, manage sessions. Plus Plus just promotes peer learning and knowledge sharing at scale. And so talks, Coach's Corner, Renee talked about that, meetups, Fresh Eyes, all those things, they can all fit within Plus Plus. And it just makes it super easy for folks to do this in a scalable way. And so we did all the integrations, we bought it, we got single sign-on, all that stuff. But then we had choices on, okay, how do we roll this out? And I think we've heard this at different parts of previous talks. It's like, how do we get people to use this? So that's where diffusion of innovations theory we found was helpful. And so it talks about adoption, and that you don't have to know all the things about diffusion of innovations theory, but it's just basically like the people are different in terms of their readiness to buy into a given tool or process or whatever it is. And so the folks on the far left, and they're not everybody, but they're open to it. And then you have other groups that you have to they're going to go kicking and screaming and fighting against you actually using that tool. And so through our work with our the Learning Council, we knew who the early adopters were. So those were the folks who cared about this stuff. And so they were the ones, when we went to roll out Plus Plus, we knew that, okay, they're super excited about it. They're like knocking on our doors to want to be the early people using it. And so they were not only ready for the vision, but they had shaped that vision that had made us select this tool. So the other thing that Roger suggests, and he has a whole big thick book, but one of the things that you can do is you can really lower the barriers to trying out the tool. And so we worked hard to make sure that the tool was super easy to use, and that's also a credit to Plus Plus. But what we did is we made sure, if people wanted to play with it, cool, go ahead. You want organizer privileges, go for it. We're not gonna gatekeep. We're gonna let you play around. We'll show you how to do things in a way that it's not gonna blow up or break everybody else's stuff. But they were ready to go. The other thing that we did is we encouraged those innovators and empowered them by letting them be part of the calls that we would have, the weekly calls that we would have, to say, okay, what are the features that you really like? What are things that are challenging? And so that all worked really, really well with our early adopters. And before I move on, if we'd tried these same strategies with the folks at the other end of the spectrum, they would have hated it. They wouldn't have wanted to be on a weekly call. They would have they just want things to work. But the early adopters, they were ready for that. And so all that trust that we'd built up with our early adopters really enabled us to use Plus Plus to support a really high profile R&D Summit event. And at Shopify, R&D means anybody who's in engineering, UX, product management, or data. It's not a great R&D term, but they had this 3-day summit. So they flew everybody in the R&D organization to Toronto, so 1,500 people, and it was really a peer learning event. And so they were every individual was able to choose their own learning journey. They could pick the sessions that they wanted to do, and they used Plus Plus to sign up for it. And so we were kind of brought in at the last minute, and we were able to use Plus Plus to promote this event. It was kind of risky. It was a last minute thing. A couple bumps, but it worked really well. It was a scrappy thing, but it worked really well. And now this peer learning experiment that they did, now we can bring it back to Shopify. And so these sessions that they did, where there was over 400 sessions, 1,500 engineers, it was crazy, but they pulled it off. And now this has established this foothold at Shopify for peer learning, and they can bring it back to the company and offer it in their offices. And so we took risks together, and we built additional trust. And we also had this win together. And so now, as we're going to approach other groups about adopting this new thing or other tools that we're going to bring down, we have that win. So now, if we think about like the early majority folks, if we go back a slide, those folks they don't care about like the newness of the innovation, but now they see something that's worked. They're like, okay, cool, I'm ready. I'll give it a shot. Like I don't want to have to deal with all the craziness, but you seem to have figured it out. So where are we at now with this? So Shopify, we're over 3,000 people, but we've had not everyone, but virtually everyone using the tool. So this is a huge win. We started in July, so this is a huge level of adoption in a very short amount of time. We've had over 14,000 event registration, which is awesome. This is not just like mandatory training. This is like people going out, creating sessions on their own, coming to us, knocking on our door, and saying, yeah, I want to run workshops about have a new promotion scheme. So like I need to get this out to all the leads. How do I do this? And so these are sessions that are organically coming in. And learning teams and then other Shopify folks that are passionate about learning, they're using plus every week to share knowledge at scale. So what are the big ideas that we want you to take away? So it's not so much just about like a particular tool, but one thing is, and this is echoed in the previous talk, learning and knowledge sharing, that would be one way. But it's hard, and as Shopify has scaled, it gets harder because there's a lot of there's more people, it's more complex. If the company was this big, we could all come together and give a talk, and then you'd know. But it's our job, and it's probably your job to help the companies figure this out. So it's supposed to be hard. The second thing is that this broader and intentional cultural infrastructure, whether it's like horizontal teams, I think that's the term that was used in the previous, or these councils or guilds of different levels of formality. You don't have to do a reorg or anything like this, but if you give people an opportunity to engage in some of the decision making or jump in and share with their peers, kind of like this, but at a company-wide level, that can build a lot of trust that can help you as you're going to launch whatever it is that you're going to launch. And you might have lots of ideas from today's sessions. The last takeaway I'd really encourage people to think about is think about diffusion of innovations. Think about who are your early adopters? How do you figure out who those people are? And then how do you build those really trusting relationships with them? How can you build trust with them, take shared risks together, see what their problems are, and then figure out how to solve them? Because through engaging with them, then it's gonna be a lot easier for you or potentially even these people that you've worked with to now engage with the people they're gonna be the hardest to get to, and if you can leverage the early adopters to tell their stories and tell their successes, they're going to be able to have a greater impact on getting those folks on board than you would. So those are the three big takeaways that we ask you to think about going forward. Finally, if you're interested in reaching out to us, we are on LinkedIn, so that's it's important to. So feel free to connect with us. We're also on Twitter, and we have 4 minutes for questions.
That was very interesting. I have more of a comment that you might use with your management. I forget the exact name, but I think it's called the Rule of 150, which is the maximum number of people you can have to communicate effectively, after which it drops off dramatically. So your problem's compounded significantly. I think Reid Hoffman wrote something about this as well. But anyway, so maybe you can buttress your arguments with some metrics like that. Just a comment.
There's the Dunbar Rule too, which is like how big a society is before you just can't know anything. And it's like 150, which is interesting that this is about the size of this conference as well. So. So the question is, when for trying to figure out how do we help scale learning at Shopify and peer learning, how long was the process, and then what other tools do we look at? It took a long time, and so Michael and Marco will attest to this. But it was not so much about the search, but it was more about just buy-in within Shopify and making sure that the teams were ready for this and that we were ready to take it on. In terms of competitors, there's not a lot of there's not great competitors to it, and so the competitors really internally built tools at this point, and we actually had built something internally to address this need. A lot of the learning management systems out there do have like live training, instructor-led training scheduling, but they're not really set up to promote pure learning. And so it's more like you need to be a LMS admin to be able to create the courses in there and schedule it and all that stuff. So there's not a comparable tool. Yeah.
So I have a question that's about the change management aspect of it, or why did you perhaps choose the diffusion of innovations as opposed to a change management model? There's no right answer. I'm just curious.
Well, so Haidee and I struggled with this a little bit because we chose the diffusion of innovations model after all of this was done. so we and that's where I think some of these models, and whether like if you're in instructional design or anything, there's kind of these more structured models for how to do things, and they don't really work very well in environments like we have. And so what instead, I think, when you know about the models and you're like, okay, I know these things are important. I know it's important to reach out to early adopters, and like other change management things would say similar things. But you just have to be ready for opportunities that come up and then make good decisions when they do come up. And that was something with the R&D Summit where it was literally weeks before the event, and we just happened to be ready, and we were able to partner with Plus to make it happen. Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. I had a quick question, which is, you mentioned this R&D summit that happened once. So how do you think about continuous learning, like beyond the summit, or things that come about after that? How do you think about socializing that and making people aware of the types of things that they need to be aware of?
An awesome question, because that was our first when we were engaging with the R&D core education folks. We were thinking, great, it's like a party for learning, but what next? So what's happening now is we're supporting the lead organizer team, and they have enough data to see who are the rockstar presenters, and they're actually re-offering these in different tracks across the business. So one of the things that's going on is there's a roadshow. So they're going to specific offices in our region and offering the workshops that where it's really important to be face to face, and then they're also offering remote, the same learning experience but remotely. So a lot of that is just they tested the learning experiences. Now they're just offering it up on Plus.
And I'll just add, like a lot of the questions that I think we hear about and see today in today's conference is like, okay, do you do online? Do you do in person? Do you do a blend? I think the answer is like yes to probably all of that, and then like how do you use one to feed the other? And it's not unlike commerce where you're going to have all these different channels, and so maybe it's a pop-up, maybe it's like you have a store, maybe it's online sales, but it's not an either or. You have to do all of them and figure out the connection. Thank you, folks.